Okay, last session of the day, team. We are incredibly excited to be presenting to you today. I have some repeat guests, some new guests joining me on today's session. We'll allow everybody a few minutes to jump in. Let me just make sure that the chat is open. Let's have a look. All right, so the chat is open. If you guys want to let us know where you're coming in from, or if you have any questions for us, you can throw them into the Q&A panel. We're going to be talking about all things metrics for the last session of today. For those of you that have been with us all day, we appreciate the commitment. Hopefully you're not as tired as we are and you've enjoyed the content that we've presented so far. Wow, there's already a lot of people in here. Amazing. Great. I asked a question earlier on if anybody wants to give me some ideas on what I should dress up as for Halloween. If you guys have any ideas of what my costume should be, throw it into the chat. Please be nice. And then we'll get going in a few seconds. All right.
About TMF man.
TMF man? like a superhero?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. TMF man. All right, we'll kick it off. So welcome to another session of TMF Maturity Day, a free event dedicated to helping organizations understand and improve the maturity of their organization as it relates to TMF. We have covered a lot of really amazing content today. Honestly, we've had such great speakers, and we've covered some really great Q&A as part of our AMA that just finished about 10 minutes ago. We've covered how to identify your organization's TMF maturity and planning for growth, building a TMF management process from start to finish. Oops, let me go backwards. And we also just covered the AMA, like I mentioned, and now we're going to focus on developing a trial master file metrics roadmap. All of these sessions have been recorded. They'll be made available to those that have registered after the event, so you can always go in and view the recordings afterwards, share them with your team, whatever you desire. All of these sessions, as I mentioned, are going to be available. They're 45 minutes long. We'll try and be a little bit better on the timekeeping for this one, but we just try to pack so much into these sessions. If you have questions throughout, please, if we have time at the end, we're going to try and answer those questions on the question tab. So you can throw them in there, everything that relates to metrics, or you can throw any question at us and we'll see if we can answer it. Just to highlight, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but obviously Monshim does provide a series of practical courses, educational courses for TMF maturity, including skill building workshops, templates, and exercises. So if you guys are interested in learning more about how you can do that team-based training and engage other stakeholders, TMF and non-TMF stakeholders to improve the TMF maturity of the organization, feel free to reach out. Okay. So let's jump into the main topic of today, which is developing a trial master file metrics roadmap. Super excited about this topic. I think a lot of people understand the value and the need for metrics, but if you don't, Kathy's going to talk a little bit about that first. But not a lot of individual organizations or teams really understand how to build a roadmap for putting these metrics in place. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and we're going to unpack what you need to do to be able to build out that metrics roadmap. This is what I look like when I'm posing for a photo. My name is Oliver Pierce. I'm the Director of Commercialization. I'm joined by Katerina Bedia, or Kathy, who's our Head of Solutions Consulting, and then also Lindsay Kerwan, who is eTMF Services Coordinator here at Monshim. Ladies, I'm super happy that you're here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Super stoked.
Yes.
All right. So what we're going to cover today, and this is the expression that you're going to get after today's sessions, all smiles from ear to ear. Why are TMF metrics important? We're going to talk about how to put in place a process for managing metrics, how to develop a metrics roadmap, so how to build out what you're going to focus on, when you're going to focus on it, and then how to leverage metrics to improve your process, and of course, internal communication and stakeholder engagement and all of the fun stuff above. what we're hoping that you leave with today is obviously a much better understanding of what TMF maturity is, and then of course how metrics play a really important role in that process, and then how that impacts inspection readiness. So all in the interest of TMF maturity. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy, who's going to talk a little bit about why are TMF metrics important. Kathy, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Oliver. I'm super stoked to be part of this event today. So yes, as Oliver said, I'll be talking about why TMF metrics are so important, the value and impact they can have on the health of your TMF. And I'll also touch a little bit on how to start thinking about which are the right ones for you and your organization. So next slide. And to kick off this topic, here's a great quote from Mark Twain, of all people. If the metrics you're looking at aren't useful in optimizing your strategy, stop looking at them. So of course, the message here that he so eloquently expressed is that your metrics should be contributing toward your strategy for improvement. Otherwise, they're virtually worthless. I had no idea Mark Twain was a TMF SME, but there you go. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about TMF metrics, it's really important to understand the integral part they play toward the health of the TMF and inspection readiness, and how they can bring value and insight. And I really like this slide because it summarizes all the key points of why we need metrics, and it does it in this cute, clever way of creating an acronym. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So they measure where you are. Yes, absolutely. At any particular moment, they can give you a little snapshot of the current status of your TMF health, sort of a quick diagnosis, which to the next point will help you evaluate how close or how far you are from being inspection ready, as it'll show you what improvements you need to make, or at the very least, it'll help direct your focus to any problematic areas identified. And through consistent generation of metric reports, you'll be able to recognize and identify through the data any trends that point to gaps in your TMF. And on the flip side, it can show you patterns that are actually supporting a healthy TMF. So it'll show you what's working and what's not. And certainly the earlier you implement a metrics plan, the earlier you can identify any trends and make any adjustments to your process if needed at an early enough time when changes are certainly easier to make. Metrics speak to the reality of your TMF health or the lack thereof. You don't need to rely on any gut feeling or assumption. Numbers don't lie. They are unambiguous and transparent. So, as long as you are indeed measuring what you're trying to measure and you understand what the numbers are representing, no psychic ability required. As I mentioned a minute ago, metrics will definitely help to identify any issues you have in your TMF and help point you in the right direction with regards to what action you need to take in order to make those necessary improvements. And of course, it can also confirm to you what actually might be working in terms of your processes. Metrics can also help support compliance with your TMF plan. When you're dealing with metrics, it's so much easier to check and to measure if your processes and activities are in line with what is scoped out in your TMF plan and your SOPs. They also allow you to share your team's successes or failures, both equally important to share. Through the metrics, you can show, using a common language, how well or how poorly teams are performing with regards to maintaining a healthy TMF. And it's a really great way to promote incentive or motivate and engage teams, especially those that aren't TMF experts, but still very much stakeholders whose buy-in you need to appreciate the importance of TMF and to motivate them to work together toward that common goal of a healthy TMF. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in detail a little later on. So what value or insight can metrics bring? What sort of impact do they have on your organization? Well, firstly, they provide a clear link to strategy. They're a great way to measure the performance against your objectives. And in terms of strategy, the picture your metrics paint can help you with so many things, that would help you plan for so many things, from planning of future trials to your operational processes. And they can definitely be used as a tool in your strategy to get buy-in from stakeholders. They also create alignment within your organization across the functional teams and stakeholders. It's easy to get everyone on the same page and to be aware of what that page is. and moving toward the same goal when you can provide such clarity that metrics bring, and that transparency that they provide, where they reveal or expose what's actually going on in your TMF. They also support continuous improvement, which is a no-brainer. I mean, metrics are constantly showing us where and how we need to make improvements in a very clear way. They really hold a mirror up to our TMF, so it certainly promotes and supports improvement initiatives. They support fact-based decisions. Again, they take the guesswork out of trying to decide what changes or improvements need to be made, and they're a great foundation for any business case to support any of those decisions. And of course, they create a standard language to assess performance, not just within the same organization, but if you're overseeing, for example, a CRO who's managing your TMF or a vendor who's contributing to your TMF, the metrics make it a very easy way to assess how they're performing, and it's in a language everyone can understand, which promotes consistency. Next slide. So now that you know what they're for and the value they bring, you want to start building your metrics plan, right? Well, not so fast. Before you start developing and implementing your metrics, it's really important to identify the ultimate goal that you want to achieve with your metrics. What are you measuring? What decisions are you hoping to make from what your metrics are showing you? And of course, depending on what your role is or what type of organization you work for, these goals can vary a bit. So on the right side of the slide, you can see some examples of what some of those big picture goals might be. So once you've identified what your goals are, you can start building a metrics plan slowly that will support those goals. And it's super important to make them attainable. Don't set yourself up for failure while still setting a relatively high standard. So in other words, make them smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So now at this point, you may be wondering, well, hey, aren't metrics supposed to be measuring those key components we keep hearing about: completeness, quality, and timeliness, which we affectionately refer to as the trifecta of TMF? Yes, absolutely. These are the key TMF parameters that you should be measuring to maintain that healthy TMF, but you'll be looking at or assessing those metrics of those parameters through the lens or perspective of your goals that you've identified. Next slide, please. So, for example, let's say you want to identify and implement team-wide TMF-focused objectives for the next 12 months. So an example of a specific objective could be that you want to reduce the time of the document QC process by 25% by the end of the first quarter of next year. So in this example, you're measuring how long the document QC process takes from start to finish, which of course speaks to the parameter of timeliness. Another example is you may want to reduce the number of documents rejected monthly by 10%. So here you would measure the document rejection rate, which of course speaks to the parameter of quality. So both of these are very specific focused objectives, but maybe they're also fitting into the framework of a broader objective, which maybe is to streamline your operational processes. Because maybe to achieve these goals, you may have to reassess your processes and procedures, your SOPs, maybe training needs to be refreshed or tweaked. So while you can start small with very focused objectives, they can also be part of some big picture goals. I think that's it for me for now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to do a quick poll. We've only got one poll, but it's important. We felt it would be important for us to understand if you guys have a process for managing metrics internally right now. So I'm going to launch this poll. So potential options are yes in the TMF management SOP, yes in the TMF plan, both A and B, or no, not yet. So let's see how the metrics process is defined and in place today at organizations. Very interesting results so far, I must say. Wasn't expecting this.
Neither was
but I guess
I.
I guess that's why everyone's here, right? So we'll give everybody 10 seconds to respond to the poll. Most of you have answered already, so we're going to give you guys another 10 seconds. Let everybody get a chance to do. So do you have a metrics process in place today, and maybe where is it documented? All right, we're going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and let's take a look at the results. So interestingly enough, the vast majority of you, or let's say 51% of you, do not have a metrics process in place today. So hopefully after today's session, you guys are going to have at least an understanding of maybe where you should start. And then, of course, the road to implementing metrics is often a long one, but one that will give you really, really great back-end benefit. Obviously, we see here that TMF management SOP, 7% of you are documenting it there, about 15% of you documenting it in the TMF plan, and then 26% are actually documenting it in both areas. Nothing really scary here outside of the fact that maybe half of you haven't put a metrics process in place. This is critical. It's part of your underlying TMF process and your TMF management plan. It certainly should be documented in your SOP, and you might refer to that in the TMF plan, but certainly something that I would suggest exploring if you're not doing so already. So with that, let's move on and talk a little bit about how to put a TMF metrics process in place for those folks that don't have one. Lindsay?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Oliver. And thank you, Kathy, for getting this session started. Move on to the next slide. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about now how to put that TMF metrics process in place. So there are a lot of metrics that can be measured at any different step of the TMF management process, from the time that you create a document to going through any different steps that you might be doing, like QC, everything like that, before it's actually filed into your TMF or your eTMF. And then there's different metrics that can be obtained as well, or measured at any different stage of the clinical trial, right? So at the startup phase, during the conduct phase, and even at closeout as well. So you want to map out your metrics process with a plan for implementation. So looking at those TMF management processes, looking at the different stages of your trial and the different metrics that you want to measure at each of those different stages. Next slide, please. Perfect. So we suggest taking a PDCA approach. And for those of you that are not familiar with PDCA, it's plan, do, check, and act. So during plan, this is a phase where you would take the time to set up whatever the expectations you have for defining the processes and the standards around filing your TMF content into your TMF, so that you can have more accurate metrics. So consider different dimensions. There might be different metrics that you might want to capture on the program level, right, across all of your studies. Other metrics just for the study itself, or for countries or different sites, or even based on the TMF reference model, so metrics according to process zones. Then think about who is involved, what metrics you want to capture, why, when, and also where you'll be defining that metrics process. So like your TMF plan, or of course your TMF SOP as well. Then during do, you're going to perform the activity. So that's performing the actual process. And then check is when you're measuring the metrics, of course. And then act is fixing the problems if you've found them. In the case where you have found them. So you've measured the metric, and then you act upon and fix those metrics. Next slide, please. So metrics are here for information, right? They're providing us with information of what is going on with the TMF. Now, that information will help you make fact-based decisions. So you're not just making your decisions on the gut feeling, right? So going back to that approach, the PDCA approach, when we're checking, so when we're measuring the metrics, we're going to measure those metrics against thresholds. Those thresholds would be acceptable levels of performance. You're going to check and measure your metrics against the process. So what were the expectations at the different stages of the process? Then check against the timeline. So whatever the frequency is that you had decided, and different metrics maybe that you had set up for different milestones of your trial, for example. Then you're going to act, right? So if you find that there's a problem, there's an issue somewhere, there's a gap, fix that problem, right? That's the corrective action. Then you're going to have to address the problem at the source. So that's the preventative action that you're going to take. So think about implementing a metrics program that's going to drive the behavior that you want, because all of those metrics are providing you with information so that you can make good decisions going forward. Next slide. Over to you now, Oliver.
All right, thank you very much, Lindsay. So just in recap, so we've talked about the value of metrics, we've talked about why we need to think about metrics, and then we've looked at some of the first and early steps that we can take to evaluate the process of implementing metrics. Now we're going to talk about road mapping. Now, road mapping is a really interesting exercise. So we're going to talk about maybe what are the different types of metrics that you could focus on, because there are a lot. We're going to talk about the low-hanging fruit metrics, the metrics that you're able to tackle right away, that maybe you need to tackle right away, and those that might need to be for long term. We're going to talk about what a metrics roadmap looks like and how to build one out. And then we're going to move on to assigning responsibility and improving communication. So if we start with the different types of metrics, there are lots of different types of metrics, and I find it very useful to kind of group these into those core areas. Now, Kathy talked a little bit about the trifecta. So we've got the completeness, quality, and timeliness. But if we look at, there are some other groups of metrics. So there might be administrative type metrics that we want to look at that focus on some of the admin side of the TMF process, and will give us maybe an indication of whether TMFs have defined ownership and maybe even planning measures in place, and we can measure the success of those measures. Of course, completeness is focusing on the, giving metrics and insight into what the TMF contains and all of the documents that are expected at the current point in the study or for completed trials at the end of the trial. Quality metrics are going to be metrics that focus on a quality measure, whether that be document content, metadata, and indexing, to make sure that they are complete and accurate. Timeliness metrics are going to indicate whether documents are available when expected or needed, and how long documents take to get finalized and filed. And then we've got system use metrics. So if you're using an eTMF system today, or if you're using another system to manage TMF content, hopefully a validated system, you might want to look at things like user-based metrics, like identifying the adoption of the tool at large or parts of the system. You can also measure how frequent user logs in or completes tasks to understand where there might be individual issues that you could address. And then we've got volume-based metrics. So these metrics can give you an insight into the different types of documents that you might be receiving, but also maybe the volume of the content, right? Where am I receiving most of my content from? And the size of the documentation, maybe the types of files, the documentation. I'm getting certain file sizes from certain types of organizations and stakeholders. So if we think about all of those metrics groups, there's lots of different metrics for you guys to try and take a look at, right? And it can be overwhelming. So if you have all of these potential metrics that you want to start focusing on, and maybe you don't have a system today, because that's not always a luxury that everyone sees themselves in, where do you start, right? So like there are so many different metrics. We could focus on the percentage of duplicate documents, the percentage of issues with documents, documents that are misfiled. There are certainly going to be certain metrics that you're going to want to focus on first, and maybe those that are going to be a little bit more cumbersome to tackle right away, and so you need to think about them in more long-term perspective. So let's talk a little bit about how you can start to map those low-hanging fruits, so your corrective action metrics, and then your long-term strategy. What sort of metrics you might want to measure that support a preventive action? And I think the message here from me is that Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was your metrics program. So you got to be confident in your approach and make sure that you understand that it's not something that you can do and start tracking every single metric and start improving your process based on every single metric. It just will take time. Maybe you don't have processes set up today to be able to get useful data from that process, or maybe you don't have the tools or the system to do so. So if we look at a little bit into the low-hanging fruit, I've listed out a couple different examples of metrics that you might want to be focusing on, and maybe the reason that you would want to take action to start measuring and evaluating these metrics. So if we look at maybe the percentage of documents for which quality defects related to content, so missing signatures, issues with annotations, and these were identified during the QC process, we might identify this as a low-hanging fruit. We have the team in place. We are able to measure these issues. So the reason is that we want to fix the quality issue to ensure that high-quality documentation is being filed in the TMF. Another example of a low-hanging fruit might be that the percentage of documents received and finalized by their due dates is an issue for you, right? So you might want to ensure that TMF documents are received and processed in a timely manner. That might be something that you could tackle fairly easily with a little bit of retraining, better documentation of the process, and then ultimately aligning your team. And then we've got maybe expected documents. So maybe there's an issue with the percentage of expected documents that have gone through all of the necessary reviews and approval or QC processes that are considered final. And this is really important, not only during the study, but even more so important at the end of the study. When we're closing out the study and we're locking down the TMF, we want to make sure that that TMF is actually ready for archive, because at that point we're saying, this is inspectable. We are ready for this TMF to go through an inspection. Now, there may be metrics that we might want to look at that take a little bit more back-end work for us to put in place. There's some adjustments that we need to make to the process. We might need to have, some better tracking in some of the tools that we're using, and they might support a more longer-term strategy, a more preventive strategy. So let's say, for example, we look at things like the number of users with credentials in an eTMF that have not logged in. It's not something maybe that we've identified as a critical issue that we need to focus on first, but it might be something that could contribute to quality issues or timeliness issues in the future. If we have issues with people not using the tools that we have in place, then we might run into some issues later on. We might look at things like the percent of active TMFs that have a documented TMF plan. Do we have TMFs today that don't have a well-documented TMF plan or a TMF plan at all, right? And so you might want to look at how you can assess the internal process of a TMF plan and its overall efficiency within your team. And then finally, milestones. I think milestones are something that we're all used to, but how does that relate to TMF, right? How are we able to make sure that we're filling those placeholders that are being created or capturing and obtaining the documentation that we need to collect at each of the core milestones of our study? And so that might not be a critical issue that we want to focus on right now. It might be something that supports a longer term strategy that might have an impact on other metrics. But we can then start to look at reviewing the process and maybe even retraining the team on how that might unfold. So that's really about how to start thinking about how do we tackle low-hanging fruit metrics versus metrics that might contribute to our long-term TMF strategy. So how does that work and how does that move into a roadmap? Because this is the core function of this metrics program. Again, this is designed to be able to, for you to have a plan for how you roll out and start measuring and fixing issues that come from the metrics that you're measuring. So if we look at here, I've sort of provided an example improvement roadmap, and this is something that you guys can develop on your own. It doesn't need to look like this, but it's really, really important that you identify the metrics group that you may want to focus on. It doesn't need to be in this order, of course. It could be in whatever order, and it should be within whatever order you define as an organization on what you should be focusing on. But let's just say that, through the analysis that I performed, that timeliness is a major issue for us, and we want to tackle timeliness first because we feel like that's impacting our process the most. So we look at timeliness as a metrics group, and then we might look at what metrics we want to start measuring. So we look at maybe the percentage of documents that have been filed on time. We might look at the processing time it takes to have documents processed and filed in the TMF. And then obviously we might be logging queries on documents as we're receiving them or as they're being uploaded. What's the resolution time on those queries that are being logged? And then we're going to look at things like, well, what's the frequency that we want to look at this? Now, I've put monthly here for these different metrics, but it could, there could be metrics that you look at that you want to measure over a longer period or even a shorter period of time for you to be able to get the data that you need to be able to properly evaluate whether you're meeting the threshold or the benchmark that you've set for yourself. And then I think this is the most important thing about building a metrics roadmap, is that you should always tie what you're going to be doing over that time period. So the quarter, the month, even the week, if that's how granular you want to get, is really tying it back to those team objectives, right? Kathy talked a lot about how to define your overarching high-level goals. From those goals, you're then going to design some objectives that you want to focus on. So improving the timely filing of documentation, reducing quality issues. It's important that when you identify and build out your metrics roadmap and the metrics that you want to start tracking, that you tie it back to a team objective so that you're able to ensure that not only you understand how improvement in these metrics contributes to your larger team goals and objectives, but also your team understands, so that they know that the work that they're doing is not in vain and it's really designed in support of a strategic objective, not just an operational objective. And then I find it's really important to make sure that you can also identify owners and or teams that are going to be responsible for these metrics. There, if we look on the Q4 timeframe, here we're talking and focusing much more on system use, and so we might want to look at people that are owning the systems to be able to actually manage and be responsible for those types of metrics. It's important that you don't always assign just one individual to these metrics, but certainly identify individual groups or teams that might lead that effort. But it's certainly a collaborative process. And so you should have owners and then you should have stakeholders in that process. So that's pretty much, what a very, very simple metrics improvement roadmap could look like. Certainly, you could create a very, very robust roadmap with lots of different parameters that you might want to look at. But I would suggest starting simple and then building off it as you learn more. The next piece that we're going to talk about is stakeholders and how to engage those stakeholders. So Kathy, I'll hand it over to you to kind of talk about how you can use metrics to engage stakeholders.
Sure. Thanks, Oliver. So as I did allude to earlier, another great way to use TMF metrics as a strategy is to engage stakeholders, specifically the non-TMF stakeholders or the non-TMF experts who still have very much an impact on your TMF. They're producing documentation that need to find their way into the TMF. They're still contributing to the health of it in that way, but maybe they aren't quite aware of the importance of that or the part they play in that and how to get there. So besides, the no-brainer educating and training, a great way to engage is to do this by assigning accountability, by defining quite clearly who is responsible for ensuring which documents or sections of documents find their way into the TMF in a timely, complete way with good quality. So, these are individuals or teams that may be authoring documents, maybe they're signing off on them, or maybe their responsibilities to have oversight of all that. Whatever the case may be, once you've identified these roles or teams, you can then assign them to the appropriate sections or artifacts of the TMF. And you can use the TMF reference model as your guide, and then establish and define KPIs that go along with that. Key performance indicators really establish a clear framework or guidance from which to work, and they allow you to measure if the identified benchmarks are actually being met. So once you've established these roles and responsibilities, document it. If it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? And a RASI is a great way to do that. Either you can have it as its own independent document, or it can be a part of your TMF management plan. Either way, as long as it's documented and accessible to all, that'll work. And lastly, share your metrics findings. Let your metric reports do the talking. Any problem areas in your TMF will be demonstrated in the metrics, and that's a great motivator for those responsible for those problematic areas to focus on improvement. So assign accountability, document that scope of responsibility, and share your metrics findings.
Amazing. And one thing I'll add that I think is important, maybe if you want to get bonus points for sharing your findings, is to really look at how you can create really great visualizations of that data. Giving someone an Excel spreadsheet with just 1,000 lines of piece of data, it might be meaningful for some, but it's certainly not going to be meaningful for all. And so look at some additional tools, maybe even your eTMF system that you're using, to be able to pull visualizations that you can use to present to your team, but also present to your leadership group, to the rest of the individuals that you need to engage to understand the value of TMF. If you need to go out there and get new training for team members, get a budget for improvement to your process, the best way to explain why you need that is through sharing those findings. Lindsay, let's talk about how that works from a communication perspective.
Let's do that. So we're going to be using metrics to help us improve our communication. And that's the communication across all of the TMF stakeholders, right? So I don't know about you, but I really love graphics. I love colors. I love all that formatting. It's just going to be so much easier to interpret your metrics, and easier for those ones that don't really understand maybe the TMF in the first place. So having it in an easy to read, easy to interpret manner, it's just going to be so much easier than to create that common language about what is going on with the TMF. Then all the stakeholders will be able to align. There'll be more transparency over the TMF. They'll understand it better. It's going to be clear who is accountable if any issues are coming up as well. And then this also has a direct input into your continual improvement efforts, as everyone will be aware of the gaps and that issues that are coming up. So you'll be able to then work together as a team to correct and improve the metrics that are in your TMF. Now, like we said, metrics are really there to help you to improve your TMF process. So you'll be managing your TMF in a more agile way if you're leveraging your metrics, because this will allow you then to have a more active approach rather than a reactive approach to your TMF. And if you're in a more an active approach, you'll be constantly reviewing your process. So you'll be using metrics as a source of information, and that will tell you the health of your TMF so that you can prevent any issues in the future. So in the graph that we see here, or the graphic that we have on the right-hand side, you'll be obtaining your metric. So you get your TMF metrics report, and now what? So you have this metric in front of you. Maybe it's saying that your QC, you've got 40% QC issues in your TMF. Oh God. So now you've got a metric issue. You found a gap. You found an issue in your TMF. So this is going to trigger some pathways, some escalation. Who's responsible for these metrics, or who is accountable for them? Then you're going to integrate this into your roadmap. Like Oliver presented to us earlier, you're going to have a very clear objective about how and when you're going to address it and the frequency at which you're going to try and fix this issue. Then you're going to work on the resolution. So if it was a quality issue, maybe you're training your different users. If it was documents that were misfiled, then you're going to refile them. Or if your TMF is simply not complete, then you're going to retrieve the documents and file those missing documents. So, you're going to be reviewing and improving the process on an ongoing basis. You'll be focusing the efforts where it's needed most. So we mentioned earlier in one of the other sessions, I think it was the AMA, the Ask Me Anything. You can take a risk-based approach to this as well, right? So maybe it's about, adding a QC step into your process. There's lots of different ways and means of adjusting the process and treating it in an agile way, taking this active approach to TMF management, using the metrics to improve your TMF process. So if this is sounding a little bit overwhelming and you're not quite sure where to start, a lot of you earlier on were saying that you didn't have any sort of metrics process in place at all. Don't be worried, don't be afraid. You have, a lot of good material that was presented to you today, and you also have a team of TMF experts on the line today that can assist you We provide professional consultancy services as well around TMF metrics and KPIs, and also building out that a custom-built metrics roadmap for your organization. So I think that's all that we had planned to present to you today. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll now move over to the questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kathy and Lindsay, for such a great sort of practical application of how we can start to build out this roadmap. Lots of really great comments and questions. So glad to see that everybody has enjoyed today's Q&A. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So I'm going to take a look here. So someone asked, in your experience, which TMF metric do you believe is the hardest to track and why? I think if you asked the 3 of us the same question, we would probably have different answers. Kathy, what are your thoughts on what's the most difficult metric to track?
In my experience, anything having to do with measuring completeness can be really challenging, just because, you know, there's a lot of different components there. To be able to know what's missing in your TMF, you have to know what's expected in the first place in your TMF, and that's usually associated with milestones. So, and you know, that can change a lot during the life of a trial. You can't preset that, you know, perfectly at the beginning of the trial. Things change, there are amendments, there are different versions, manuals, and so on and so forth. So, you know, you have to have a really good, strong process in place, and owners of updating that expected document list to have it always, you know, updated with the newest information, and so that you can accurately measure at any given point in time if your TMF is complete at that point in time. So that's my experience.
I love that. I love that. And what I would add to that is metrics that are difficult to track or hard to track stem from your process and the tools and the systems that you use. If you don't have well-defined and well-documented processes that teams are trained on, you're not going to get the data that you need. Tracking a metric and measuring a metric shouldn't be that difficult if you have the right tools available to you. But if you're not, if your processes aren't allowing you to give that metric good data, or for you to be able to actually measure that metric, then you're not going to get the right result, and you're not going to be able to identify where you need to improve. So I think a lot of it really starts with really making sure that you have a good understanding and a handle of what metrics can be extracted or generated from the processes that you have. What tools do you have available for you to be able to actually look and dive into those metrics? And depending on that, some metrics might be more difficult for some organizations to track than others. And so I would think a little bit more about maybe what you have in place today, what sort of infrastructure, resources that you have in place to be able to measure metrics, and that will guide on what you find most hard or least hard to track. All right, there's lots and lots of questions here. Another question in the chat was, for timeliness, what are other companies doing? Do they use essential document classifications for performing their timeliness, or is timeliness done per the milestone? Timeliness is such a challenging metric because I think it's very, very organizational specific. I think for those of you that have attended some of the industry events and you speak to people and you hear people talk about it, some organizations with much larger teams will have really specific timeliness metrics for things like filing, for other sort of timeliness related metrics that might be unachievable to a smaller organization with less resources. So I would, in comparison to maybe completeness and quality, where I would say that there definitely are some benchmarks that you should be aligning to, timeliness is one of those things that is really organizational specific, and you've got to, make sure that the timeliness metric or the benchmark that you identify, one, that it's well documented, because that's ultimately what an inspector or a regulator is going to measure you by, and it shouldn't necessarily matter if you have a slightly longer time frame for, let's say, filing of documentation than the next company that you speak to. Ultimately, what's most important is you define what you consider timely. You identify it in your procedures and your TMF plan, and then from there you measure the timeliness to make sure that you're meeting that benchmark. Ladies, anything to add on that?
I totally agree with you, Oliver. Timeliness it's a really tricky one. As you said, there's no one size fits all there. It's always a good idea to start, if you're doing this for the first time, to start with that low-hanging fruit, start very broad, and then you can make it scalable, add more granularity to it. For example, you could start with a metric that's measuring, the date of your document or when it's finalized to when it becomes finalized in the TMF and approved and all of that. So that could be one metric you're measuring, but then you can start building metrics, that kind of come in between that, like, the date when that document gets into the TMF to when the QC process is finalized to from when the QC process is finalized to, and you can also have, for example, sorry, I just went blank.
No, I think
I had too many things running in my mind, and I lost it. But anyway, the point being, there's a lot of granularity that you can build with timeliness and so many different metrics that you can measure. So it's always best to start small or broad, and then work your way and make it scalable, and start measuring all the different things that timeliness could show you.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you bring on a really good point there, even though you lost your train of thought a little bit. I think ultimately what you were saying was that, there are lots of different dates that we might want to track over the course of the study when it comes to timeliness. You have to identify which of those dates are most important and most important to focus on first, because there may be 6 to 10 plus different dates for documents as they go through their life cycle. But tracking all of them from day one might not necessarily give you the data that you're looking for. You might want to work towards that so that you can understand timeliness issues across the process. But I would suggest starting with some of the bigger kind of milestone dates like filing and QC and approval dates as a core sort of timeliness metric, measuring the time frame from those dates to the other dates, and then look to expand to say, we think that there's an issue here, but we're not necessarily measuring timeliness of these steps in the process. Maybe we can start to measure that to be able to evaluate maybe where there are other areas for improvement. I think we're a little over time, but that's just because we got a really engaged audience. I want to thank everybody for the time spent today listening to us across all of the sessions. It's been so fun being able to talk about these subjects and give people some really great advice and knowledge and expertise. Of course, as a reminder to everybody, if the subjects that you saw today were interesting, if you feel like there are still questions that you have or missing pieces that you want to explore, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to try and help as much as possible, guide you in the right direction. Of course, we have some opportunities for you guys to go through training or other sort of practical skill building exercises through some of our offerings. But of course, if you just need some advice and guidance, we're more than happy to be able to help you as much as we can. With that, I will close today's session. Thank you, everybody, for such a great attendance. It's so great to hear and see such great feedback in the session. Kudos to Kathy and Lindsay for doing such a great job. I thoroughly enjoyed having you here, so thank you so much for joining me.
And thank you, Oliver. Thank you.
All right, we'll close it for today. Look out for more things coming from Montreal. We'll speak with everybody soon. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you're dialing from.